Welcome to the voices of transparency and excellence. We're not pivoting, the world is spinning like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judi.
Welcome to our podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. I'm Judi Clarke.
And I'm Rick Gatteau, and today's podcast is in commemoration of our 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Remember that document? So today we have Richard Tomczak here with us. He is a PhD in history and is the Director of Faculty Engagement here at Stony Brook University. Ricky, thanks so much for coming on today's episode.
Thanks for having me.
Great. We're really excited to talk about the USA at 250 is our topic for today. So I'm going to say a word in it that I've never said, and that is as we approach America's Semiquincentennial on July 4th, Ricky, take us back to the historic events that led to the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Sounds good. I want to start by, Rick, Judi, thank you for having me on today. It's great to be here. And I'll start by taking us back about 20 years before the Declaration of Independence to a conflict known as the 7 Years' War. This is between Britain and France. And some historians call it the Global War for Empire. Others provocatively call it the First World War because it takes place on 5 different continents. The only continents it doesn't take place on are Australia and Antarctica. And in the early years of that conflict, it's not going so well for Britain. France is defending their forts along the Great Lakes. They are even taking British forts in the Champlain Valley. Fort William Henry, enshrined in the movie Last of the Mohicans, excellent movie. That's in 1757. So in 1758, William Pitt, who is the secretary for the Southern Department, he's basically in charge of the colonies back in Britain. He comes up with a pretty provocative strategy where he's going to fund the colonists' provincial armies to invade New France, Canada, and knock out the French in North America, take their empire, and force them to the negotiating table. And so that's exactly what he does. And the militia, the American militia, fills up right away. In fact, colonial newspapers report this spirit of service, this overwhelming spirit of service. And the strategy works. In 59, they take Quebec City. In 60, they take Montreal. And New France surrenders, of knocking the French out of North America. And the war continues for 3 more years elsewhere around the world. But by 1763, when the treaty is signed, Britain has defeated France, their historic enemy, and also taken possession of Canada, now the province of Quebec, and Florida. So they have this unbroken empire in mainland North America, in addition to their sugar colonies in the Caribbean. But there are 2 concurrent forces that are about to collide with one another. On one hand, you have the American colonists, who are British provincials. They're British Americans. They're British people born in the Americas. And they come out of this conflict feeling as if they had won the war for king, country, and empire. It was not until 1758 or 59 when they send soldiers abroad that the war starts to go in Britain's favor. And so there's this enormous wave of British patriotism in America. And on the other hand, now Parliament has to reckon with the money that it had used to finance the American companies and taken on quite a bit of debt to do so. And so their solution, originally pretty benign, is just to enforce taxes that were already on the books. The first one they identify is the Molasses Act, later called the Sugar Act. That's a 1730s law that is revived in 1764 and receives some pushback. That's a tax on sugar that's outside of the colonies. It's an import tax. And there's some pushback within the colonies, but nothing compared to 1765. Britain still has the same issue. They're administering now this massive empire. They've got a foothold in India. They have Quebec. They have Florida, and they have this debt. And so one way that they decide to generate revenue is the Stamp Act, the infamous Stamp Act, 1765. And for us, I feel like, again, relatively benign. It's not that different from like a postage stamp that would appear on all legal documentation, which in the 18th century is a lot of paperwork. Like this is pre-DocuSign. So any legal paperwork, any deed or probate record or will would have to have some form of this tax paid on it. And that in particular really incites pushback from American colonists. And it does so in a way that's very specific at first. It's a debate that centers on the constitutional relationship, not to bore the listeners, but a constitutional relationship between the colonies and their colonial assemblies, who have elected representatives from the colonies, and Parliament, which is meant to be the governing legislative body of the empire, and up until that point had been. And what the Stamp Act does is force a conversation around, does Parliament have the right to raise taxes without the consent of the colonial assemblies that had the elected representatives? So we famously get no taxation without representation from this debate. And both sides dig in, and over the course of the next 5-6 years, I mean, Parliament eventually repeals the Stamp Act, but it still has this issue of generating revenue, and they dig in on their side too, that Parliament is the supreme legislating body. It always has been, and they can enforce these taxes across the empire. It's not just the 13 colonies that receive these different taxes and customs and duties. But for the colonists, they also dig in that it is their elected representatives, that their sovereignty relies on the franchise of voting for representatives. And what goes from a debate around taxation evolves into a debate around legislation, and then ultimately a dispute about the constitutional jurisdiction, the British Constitution, of where the colonies fit within the empire. And I guess the last thing I'll add to this real quick, I don't want to take up too much time on this topic, but where's the king in all this? Usually when we learn about it, it's the king that's at the forefront, of the American Revolution, or the origins of the American Revolution. And while this had primarily remained in the domain of a dispute between Parliament and the political and intellectual elite of the colonies, in 1775, the Second Continental Congress, which is a body of all 13 colonies, sent delegates to Philadelphia to meet about all these disputes and the tensions and the disagreements taking place and the British responses to it. And they send an olive branch petition to the king. And they say, we've had these disagreements with Parliament over the past 10 or so years, but the king can intervene. We're loyal subjects. And the colonies are happy to be part of the British Empire with the crown as their sovereign. And the king does just about the worst thing you could possibly imagine. He goes in front of Parliament, rejects this petition. He declares the colonies an insurrection and hires mercenaries and sends redcoats to North America. And any hope of reconciliation with the crown kind of died with the olive branch petition. And so by 1776, you have real conversation and momentum around independence.
What's fascinating about what you just took us through this timeline is, you don't understand where you are. You don't understand where you're going till you understand where you've been. And what is so interesting now is those lessons learned, because as you're talking and laying it out, I am looking and crosswalking today with a lot of navigation of systems of power back at a time in which it's king country empire, looking at the tax tariffs, understanding like two parties that are trying to reconcile. And the fact that they came up with kind of this olive branch to the king and a king's rejection of really this diplomacy of bringing people together. Wow, they say that history echoes the present and the future. So I do hear an echo in that. So
Yeah.
My question is, you have an opportunity, and I know that there's some events that you're going to partake in this summer around the 250th anniversary. I wonder, in that platform, do you have an opportunity? Because people are looking at pathways forward. Do you have an opportunity, or where do you see that knowledge that you've gained through understanding the timeline and really helping people understand the path forward to who we are as the United States, democracy, civility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think even to back up a little bit for some context, when I was in graduate school, so I graduated from Stony Brook in 2021, and I'm very lucky to be able to call my professors, my former advisors, colleagues now, as in the department. But a lot of the stuff that we read, very foundational works in early American history and the Revolution, was written around the time of the bicentennial. And so there was all this excitement to the Organization of American Historians, really big names that I looked up to, Bernard Bailyn, Edmund Morgan, greats of early American history who wrote so much of the foundational stuff we understand about it today. And it really inspired me. So with the 250th approaching, I was like, I'm going to participate in as many events as possible. If there's an event, I'm going to email them, see if I can get in to talk about it. And I think to your question, so just to summarize some of the events that I've gone to, I was able to participate in the 250th of Lexington Concord last year, the first that shuttered around the world. That was very cool. That was hosted by the Center for the American Revolution and Concord Museum. And it was a 2-day, really one full day, open to the public conference, reevaluation of the field of where are we, what was so important about 1775.
Yeah.
And Judi, as you point out, the lead up to the American Revolution, kind of distinguishing 1775. And then that same organization hosted America's 1776, and I was there and part of a panel of scholars who were looking at folks who received news of the Revolution outside of the 13 colonies. My area of specialty is actually Canada. My area of specialty is the province of Quebec, which is added to the British Empire after the 7 Years' War. And so I look at how just everyday Canadians responded to this turmoil taking place around them. And I think two things emerge from these different events that, I've been going to and speaking at. The first is a really serious reevaluation of some of the founding knowledge, kind of going back to the basics and reevaluating where are we, what is the story that's being told in academia, and how can we sort of imagine this for a broader audience? How do we get it outside of history monographs that professors read and then get it to the general public? And then the role that I play is looking at how everyday people interpreted the American Revolution. I think that's still a message that inspires folks, is that the revolution, it's one thing, the political and intellectual elite, the so-called founding fathers, that get a lot of the focus of the 250th and the American Revolution, rightfully, I think, for their contributions. But they inspired people to participate in boycotts and protests and to take civil action. And women were elevated in public standing for a moment during the American Revolution, where they became head of households in the absence of their husbands, and workers were able to, laborers were able to join either side of the conflict to demonstrate their loyalty. And so that's one area. I study workers. I'm a labor historian. And so that's one area that I really enjoy talking about. And I still think that people, especially the general public, just really enjoys hearing about just everyday folk who put down the rake and the hoe on their farm and picked up the musket and went and joined the fight.
As you look back in history, if you were to look back at the founding fathers of our democracy and our government, what would they say now, 250 years later?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rick. I'm laughing because I had met with Melanie prior to this podcast, and we were going over some of the preliminary questions or topics that might be discussed, and this had come up, and I was laughing to think about just kind of taking the political intellectual elite, the founders, dropping them in 2026, and like, what are their additional impressions? And some of it I feel like is probably pretty surprising. So I'm going to split it up into two, I think, things that they would be pretty thrilled about, and then two things that they probably would not be so thrilled about, or maybe they'd have some questions about. So the first is, they would be, I think, absolutely thrilled that the Constitution, which I know we're at the 250th of the American Revolution, so the Constitution's a little bit later, but I think they would be thrilled that the Constitution is still the law of the land, and that the amendment process had operated as it was intended to expand that legal document. And it's often easy to forget how revolutionary the Constitution was. The idea of a written Constitution, it was the first of its kind, a Bill of Rights that laid out in very plain English exactly what the liberties and freedoms and privileges and entitlements American citizens had access to. Prior to that, sort of the next best thing was the British Constitution, which was hundreds of laws, if not thousands of laws, that required lawyers to piece together legal codes and precedents and court rulings and feudal custom and try to make a judgment. And that's what had led to that ambiguity around the Stamp Act. And so the founders were trying to avoid that by just laying it all out in one single document. There's not a ton of interpretation here. I famous last words, but
Mhm.
at least laying it out in one document. And then the durability of it. I mean, they have the amendment process kind of figured out, but it's not a given that that single document is going to last any amount of time. I mean, during the French Revolution, they go through multiple constitutions in a matter of years. They have the Legislative Assembly, they have the National Assembly that dissolves, and then they write a new constitution for the Legislative Assembly and a new constitution. And so there's no guarantee that the capital C constitution is going to last. And I think getting back to your question, Rick, I think they'd be blown away by that, and that it has become the example for the rest of the world to have this type of document at the core of their government. The second thing, this is going to sound strange, so I'm happy to answer questions about it. I know we live in the era of misinformation, but I think that they would be blown away by how informed people are about politics today. I think in 2026, the amount of information that an individual can consume and then talk about and various different platforms in person with people. In the 18th century, leading up to the American Revolution, the way that people got news was through letters, but the everyday people mostly got news from their ministers, who would talk with the political elite and then translate that information into sermons alongside scripture and sort of interpret it for people. And I think one of the things that concerned them going into the early 19th century was, how do you maintain investment? It's one thing for the war effort, but it's another thing once the war is over, once the energy and the momentum behind it slows into debates over laws and taxes and things like that. You have to maintain people, you have to get people invested. The cornerstone of a democracy is voting and engagement with those liberties and rights. And I think to that point, I think they'd be we're probably too politicized, too politically active in 2026, but I think they would be pretty impressed by the amount of information that we consume. All right, so that's two things. And then two things that they'd probably not be so thrilled about. The first is that Congress is the legislating body, the government. The system of checks and balances is really established on Congress being the expression of the people's will, the bicameral House and Senate. For a lot of different reasons, which probably too long to go into in this podcast, but I'm happy to talk to more about, is after World War II, Congress starts to really relegate a lot of its power and authority to the executive branch. Some of this is just to meet the moment of the modern 20th century and the Cold War so that the president can make decisions very quickly, could operate diplomacy very quickly and nimbly in moments of crisis. Other parts of it have to do with just political challenges and the way that our political parties are established. So I think that they would be not so thrilled that Congress has relegated a lot of power. I mean, they basically do the budget, they pass some other legislation, but it has mostly stalled out a little bit. The last thing is corporate interest in, I guess, like not just corporate interest, but money in politics and interest groups outside of the people voting for, we vote for representatives who are then subject to a whole host of outside influences when they're supposed to be the expression of the local will. They're supposed to bring local matters to the national stage, not national matters to the local stage, which is kind of like the opposite of how we think about it today. And to give you just a quote from John Dickinson, who wrote Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, it's a really important series of pamphlets that are published in 1968 in the wake of taxation. He says, quote, "A people is traveling fast to destruction when individuals consider their interests as distinct from those of the public. Such notions are fatal to their country and to themselves. Yet how many are there so weak and sordid as to think they perform all the offices of life, if they earnestly endeavor to increase their own wealth, power, and credit, without the least regard for the society under the protection of which they live, who, if they can make an immediate profit to themselves by lending their assistance to those whose projects plainly tend to the injury of their country, rejoice in their dexterity and believe themselves entitled to the character of an able politician. Miserable men, of whom it is hard to say whether they ought to be most the objects of pity or contempt, but whose opinion are certainly as detestable as their practices are destructive."
Speaking of timeless, when we talk about the pillars of democracy and really thinking about the passage that you just read, the founders spoke not only about rights, but they also talked about civic responsibility. And in your view, what does it mean to be an engaged citizen in a democratic society today? And more specifically, it's like, what are the habits, behaviors, commitments that really sustain a healthy democracy from one generation to the next?
Yeah, it's a good question, and definitely a timely question as we approach the 250th to reflect on some of this stuff. And I guess I'll speak more to the 18th century conception of democracy. I mean, what they're really aiming for is freedom from dependency, freedom from arbitrary authority. And their goal was to establish a democratic republic in which representatives would be the will of the people, that voting was one of the most important, if not the most important act that a citizen, I mean, even the concept of a citizen, someone who had just how that we all have an investment in the project of the nation, was a novel idea. Before that, they were subjects of the crown, and they had freedoms and liberties under the British Constitution, but not the same level of investment as being a citizen, where you're an active person, you're actively engaging in these processes. And I think, to your question, there's really two parts to it. On one hand, I guess it seems kind of straightforward, but on the other hand, it's quite complicated. Being a citizen is expressing those rights, liberties, and freedoms that are enshrined in the United States context in the Constitution, upholding those standards, responsibility to do so. And then, as I had mentioned, voting, to get representatives, forming that social contract between you and what your beliefs are and your rights to a representative in the government, whose then obligation, it's a reciprocal relationship, whose obligation it is then to act responsibly to uphold those values and also work on behalf of the communities and the constituents which they represent. And so that interplay is really the sort of main pillar, that social contract. In the United States, we have a pretty unique democracy because it's not just our relationship with House of Representatives members or with senators. We also have state democracies that are very robust, state constitutions that are very robust, and we have local democratic action, which is very meaningful. We vote on all sorts of different matters at the local level for ordinances, kind of regulations and rules, but then also making really important decisions about investment in the community and how money is allocated in the budget and the school board and the school systems. And so this ethos, that relationship between the individual expressing their rights and with the representatives and the government, that is, at least in the Democratic Republic of the United States, kind of the foundation.
So, Ricky, obviously, when you look at the full scope of American history, our American story, there are times, I think, at least when I was thinking back in elementary school and high school and learning about U.S. history, there's this tendency to erase the voices and experience of indigenous peoples. And I'm wondering if you could share your perspective on how do we commemorate this important milestone in American history, but not forget about and make sure that we are incorporating people who were here actually before us in this country, and how do we kind of reconcile the two?
Yeah, it's a really important point. And I will say that, I'm not going to speak for Indigenous or First Nation people or communities on this point, but I do think that it is always better to incorporate those voices as meaningfully as possible. And I'll give you an example. When I was at America 1776, a couple weeks ago in Philly, there were two Iroquois scholars in my panel. The panel was on voices outside of the white Protestant Anglo-American colonists. And they provided their oral tradition of the American Revolution. And it was just a fascinating, I think, collection of records and artifacts and ways in which the story had been interpreted over generations that is completely different from the way that a academic might approach that topic, using primary documents or, even in, I think, really good intentions, working with those communities. It's just a completely different way of expressing those ideas and the deep symbolism behind certain pieces to it and the way that the events are framed, the events that are chosen to be talked about, for sure. And so I think that's one way that, in earnest, we can incorporate Indigenous and First Nation accounts into this broader narrative.
And to piggyback on that, the United States is experiencing significant political and social polarization. Are there lessons from our shared past that can help Americans find common ground while still honoring the different perspectives and experiences?
It's a challenging question.
Yeah.
I think that I would say that in general, I would bet that most people are still very inspired by the story of the American Revolution. You know, I was in the lead up to the 250th. I wish we saw more kind of like classic iconography of the American Revolution. The Minuteman. Let's bring the Minuteman back. You know, from Lexington and Concord. I haven't seen enough of that, which you used to get with the bicentennial that really celebrated these sort of mythical icons. Part of it is like, I think in person having conversations about it is one thing. Like I go back home to Buffalo, for example. I'm from a working class community in Buffalo, and all my friends love history and we talk about it. It's a completely different conversation that exists between us, just like chatting about it, and then what exists online or through social media and things like that, the way in which algorithms sort different thoughts and ideas, present that to us in very bite-sized pieces that are very opinionated, may not be based in a whole lot of like archival evidence, just more of feeling and emotion. But I think that just going back and connecting to the communities that we're from, talking about it, what does it mean? You know, talking with different groups of people like the sort of Native American groups that I had mentioned, expanding that story outwards and just getting a better understanding of it.
So, Ricky, I know your work at Stony Brook, you have an opportunity to educate the next generation of historians. And I understand that you developed a program, kind of a mock Continental Congress with our Education Opportunity or EOP program at Stony Brook. Can you share a little about how that program originated and how students participated in that experience?
Yeah. Gosh, how much time do we have? I feel like I could talk about this.
I love this part.
So yeah, I'll keep it brief and then kind of open it up for any questions that you all might have. So I had the idea. I've always been interested in, let me actually back up just even a little bit more, a little bit of background about me as a learner. As I mentioned, I'm from a working class community, kind of untraditional background. I'm not the best sort of in the classroom lecture style learner. So I've always enjoyed active learning, things that get me out of my seat, start thinking about things creatively. And so I'd wanted, in grad school, I had thought about doing some sort of mock Congress or having students be delegates to the Second Continental Congress and seeing, could we replicate a unanimous 13 votes for the Declaration of Independence? And in grad school, I didn't have the mechanisms or I think the pedagogy, the teaching experience to really pull that off. There's also some real challenges with it where, I mean, colonies like Virginia, South Carolina, so the reasons that they wanted to, these are colonies that are plugged into the British Empire. They are plugged into rice and indigo plantations, the Atlantic slave trade. They're plugged into Virginian tobacco plantations. And I don't want students to have to debate that type of thing and put them in that position. And so I had always kind of shied away from it. I'm like, oh, could I put around like buffers or something to mitigate that type of debate? But ended up kind of just sidelining it for a little bit. And then I was thinking about, I taught SB 102, our first year seminars, and I was teaching with EOP, and I'm like, I think we could do some sort of SB 102, expanded outwards, where we have students subdivided into groups. So I ended up having 65 students subdivided into 13 groups. We were in the big active learning classroom in Frey Hall. And I arranged the room geographically. So New England, New Hampshire was the furthest away from Georgia. So geographically, to replicate some of the geography, right? And the first 5 weeks, they researched an argument for reconciliation or independence. And then the last 5 weeks, we had a straight up mock Congress. I had a gavel.
Wow.
Called the Congress to order. I was president of the Congress, and I'd read the order of the day. The students would come up and they had roles in their groups. So 3 students would give speeches. Then there would be a period of dissent where the floor would be open for feedback, sort of dissent, debate. And then after dissent, there was a recess where 2 other people in their group had to go around to the other groups and politic and try to win people over to their side. And I think even backing up a little bit, so around that debate piece, what I ended up doing, and I worked with Mark Chambers in history on this and Pam, the director of EOP, going back to some of my original concerns about this, is what it ended up doing is really narrowing the focus of the debate. So the first 5 weeks, we discussed all of it. We talked about the contours of the way in which the economy worked, especially in the South, and slave labor, the stakes that the delegates had from those colonies and maintaining that system. But then for the debate itself, we narrowed it very, very specifically around the constitutional arguments that the delegates put forth. And I wanted them to be 21st century students evaluating it. So they're not role-playing as delegates. I want them to be 24 students looking at the evidence that their colonies laid out, focusing very specifically on the constitutional arguments around it. And that's what they're debating. And the outcome was hilarious. I feel like if you could bottle teaching sometimes, like that's exactly like, they got so into it. And they throw in these like modern colloquialisms to it. So New York was pro-reconciliation. They're merchants. They're invested in the British Empire. And they don't have a lot of reason to side with New England, who is instigating violence, against the British. And so the New York group goes up there and they defend their merchants, that they're staying in the British Empire, and they plan to vote for reconciliation. And all New England's like, you can't do this. Like, you can't do this. And one student from New York stands up. She's like, handle your finances. Step your game up. It's so funny. So it's a way you would like to talk about it today, There was a very fine line coming from that experience between historical enthusiasm, which if you look at the Congress, like they're going here, if they agree, they're booing each other. They're sort of like, you don't want to replicate quite that level of agitation in the classroom. And I guess enthusiasm is a better word for it. But you also kind of need that energy. And so I would be constantly banging on my gavel, order, because they would always end up like booing each other. Please, let's just dial this back a little bit. But they did such a great job with it. And going into the vote for the final vote for independence, they had 2 chances at independence, unanimous 13. And they had got down to 12-1. Wow. South Carolina held out.
Okay.
They needed the indigo trade. They needed to maintain that. They couldn't rebel against their only trading partner in Britain. It's a good argument. And the class just like erupted during a recess. Like I gave them a recess. The class just like erupted. I'm like, okay, guys, let's take a breath here. All right, we're going to do this. We're going to take one more vote. Whatever happens, whatever. And they ended up, the outrage around that one vote ended up bringing a couple back over to reconciliation. So it ended 10-3. And then they signed an olive branch petition. The Congress, they didn't get it in their first shot either. They signed an olive branch petition first because they couldn't get unanimous 13 votes for independence. And they were all like, oh, okay. So we didn't lose. I'm like, no, it's like, that's how it actually operated in 1775. And so it was a really interesting experience of just like really handing over autonomy to the students to learn about it.
But, it's interesting, the question that I guess I'm going to leave rhetorical. But, when you think about the American experience and you think it's endured wars, social upheaval, economic crisis, and a real periods of profound transformation. And then you think about, so what is a message you would leave for young people that will shape America for the next 250 years? That experiential learning that you just shared. I mean, it's one thing to impart knowledge. It's another thing to actually immerse them into really understanding what it meant for negotiation and what you had to lose. Once you've experienced that, I mean, you become a surrogate of all the lessons that came out of that class. I wish that class was mandatory. I wish that the subjects could be democracy and all the pillars that we've talked about today, and a way in which you don't just consume it, but you have to defend it.
Yeah.
Maybe that is part of the civil society, and maybe that is part of, when we talk about the grace and the path forward, is to literally stand in the shoes of those who created the path. And you did that in your class.
Yeah. Thanks, Judi.
Well, Ricky, thank you so much. I've learned so much.
Yeah.
It reminded me a lot of history that I'd forgotten about. Yeah, and I'm just processing a lot of what you shared today, and I just want to thank you so much for your insights, expertise, and we're grateful that our Constitution endures today, and that I think a great appreciation that we do live in a democracy that we think sometimes forget or take for granted. So thanks for bringing us back to this important place in time.
Yeah, absolutely.
We hope our listeners find these discussions informative and empowering. We want to thank you again for your incredible, thought-provoking, and informative historical recollection of who we are and why we stand and where we do today and where we were in the future. So, that being said,
For now, I'm Rick Gatteau.
and I'm Judi Brown Clarke, and thank you for tuning in.